Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Lesson for today comes from Lord, Sometimes I Don't Feel Saved, chapter 12, which is entitled To a Special Lady. Unlike what we've been covering up to this point, our subject of the book has changed from 1 John to 2 John. We finished out the first letter at this point. Let's go ahead and start at the very beginning of the chapter here. The author quotes Matthew 22:14, which says, "Many are called, but few are elect," or chosen. What an interesting proclamation by Jesus. What was he telling to his followers? That God would pick some and reject others according to his own desires and apart from their wishes? Hardly. This statement by Jesus follows the parable of the royal wedding feast, which is in Matthew 22:1-13. Initially, the invitation went out to the insiders, those who would be expected to receive an invitation to such a grand affair. They rejected the invitation with varying responses of disdain. Then the invitation went out to those folks on the wrong side of the tracks. Many of those people would come to the feast, be fitted with a wedding garment, and enjoy the celebration. One man, however, refused the garment and was rejected from the feast. So who then is called or invited? Well, ultimately, everyone who receives an invitation, who are chosen or elect, are they not those who accept the gracious invitation, not on any merit of their own, but simply those who said yes? They were those who chose to be chosen. So when we're talking about this idea of election, there are certain people who want to sort of remove the participation of the individual believer from this calling that God has given us. But Jesus himself, in the parable that's being described to us here, that we can read in Matthew chapter 22, is not saying that at all. He's saying that the invitation goes out, but the elect are ultimately the ones who attend to the invitation. The author expands on that further by saying, in Jesus' parable, the fact that the individual's response is implied in no way denigrates the freely given gift, the invitation. In fact, the chosen or elect ones are still very special. So let's continue with some of our text from 2 John and the first 3 verses of that book. The elder to the chosen lady and her children, whom I love in truth, not I alone, but also all those who have come to know the truth, on account of the truth which remains among us. Indeed, it will be with us forever. Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, the Son of the Father, in truth and in love. Our introduction from John here includes some important things, including the idea of calling, or this being addressed to the elect lady or the chosen lady. One of the ideas that's being emphasized here, even with John calling himself the elder, is that that word itself has some different meanings. But literally, the term just means an older man. He's just calling himself a senior person to them. But the term also could be used in a sort of a title sense, or the technical idea of an elder, like we would think of in the church, a leader of a church. Someone who has spiritual guidance role over the church. And sometimes in the Bible we see that term interchangeably translated bishop or overseer. It's one of the same ideas there. But the third possible interpretation is that John uses the word of old, and he talks about some ideas that have come from the past, from the ancient ones, the eyewitnesses, those of old, to be the sort of authorities from which the ideas of the gospel are, or of the spiritual knowledge are derived. It's sort of the chain of custody of where we get our knowledge about the spiritual wisdom that we have. I think it's possible and not entirely unreasonable for John to sort of have contextually put this term on as his term of address for this letter, so that we would think of all three of those ideas depending on what part of the letter we're in. John tends to be someone who is almost poetic in his prose, in his literary style. He tends to use words that are very loaded and heavily representative to have multiple meanings. And just to explain this very briefly, what I mean by that is, like, if we think about the beginning of his gospel, right, he talks about Jesus as the Word that was at the beginning, that created the world when God spoke it in the beginning. He also talks about Jesus as the light that was illuminating the world that at the beginning and in creation, but also the light that came down among people. And so we can see the way John uses these words that have a lot of spiritual meaning and symbolism behind them, and they have different sort of facets depending on how you look at them. They can have deeper meaning in one direction or another, while still being harmonious in their agreement with the ultimate topic that's being described. So all I said, just say by that, I said all that to say, I don't think it's entirely wrong to say that he may have meant in one of those interpretations for himself and his title in this particular location in our scriptures. And the author says it this way: no matter which way we understand the term, John's use of elder is his way of calling attention to his long connection with the church. He's asserting his role among them. Continuing on, though, with this greeting, the phrase "to the elect lady and her children" has three possible interpretations of its own, which are not a matter of John being poetic, but more of how do the readers understand what is being said. So those we need to look at with a little bit more scrutiny. The first possible interpretation is that there is some unknown sister in a local church. Secondly, a chosen woman named Syria, which would make the word lady into a proper name. I mean, that wouldn't be entirely impossible. There are women running around with names like Duchess and Queen. There might be someone named Lady somewhere in the Greek world. And number three, a lady named Eclecte, which means elect or chosen as a proper name. And finally, the fourth interpretation, I think I said there were three, but I misspoke, is simply a metaphor for a local church. So let's look at all of these options. One of the early Christian writers, Clement of Alexandria, made the case that it was option three, that there was a lady named Eclecta who was the one that John was writing to. It seems like that would be unlikely, because in verse 13, John says that there's another chosen lady that is sending her greetings. So there would have to be two women who have the same name that are addressing one another. The second option, identifying the sister as someone named Syria, also lacks early support. So if we choose to see the letter as written to an individual and not metaphorically, the first option is the best, that it's just some woman who we don't know her name. Okay. The best alternative option from our author's perspective here, though, and my personal view as well, is that this term of address of the elect lady was actually a metaphor for a local church somewhere. The author says it this way: we can, however, make a strong case for the term being a metaphor or personification of the local church. The pronouns for you throughout the introduction here and then continuing on throughout the rest of the book are plural. It's possible to see these plural forms addressing the lady and her children, but it seems to fit better for it to be figurative. Notice that the lady is chosen, she is special, and so by natural association, so are her children. John is addressing a church as a metaphorical woman who has metaphorical children who are members. John loves these people who are located in the truth, the author says here. The wording of whom I love in truth is, he says that's important. It's not necessarily truly, but it is located in truth. That he says that the way that this is phrased. John loves these people who are located in the truth because of their mutual concern for the truth. Grace and mercy and peace will be theirs because they are living out the truth in love and are proclaiming truth and love. And then the rest of the book here follows the normal pattern for a letter, as we would expect. Let's read a few more verses from 2 John 4 through 6. I rejoice greatly that I found some of your children walking in the truth, just as we have received a commandment from the Father. And now I ask you, lady, not as though I am writing you a new commandment, but one which we had from the beginning, that we should love one another. And this is love that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you heard from the beginning, that we should walk in it. So as we're looking at this here, we're seeing this very familiar pattern. John has said this in our previous book. In 1 John 2:7, we saw that it's not a new commandment I give you, but one that we've had from the beginning. And on both of these occasions, he is referring to Leviticus 19:15. This is love your neighbor as yourself. This is something that the people who follow God have known basically forever. This is the commandments that should have been first in their minds all along. And it's important to note, the author says here, for John, love is not simply something we do, it is a way to walk, it's a way to live. That there's a practice of love, that we are walking in God's commandments, and therefore we abide in love. So finally we get to some more of the text here in verse 7. Many deceivers who do not confess that Jesus Christ came in the flesh have gone out into the world. This one is the deceiver and the antichrist. Watch out for yourselves in order that you might not lose the thing for which we have worked, but that you may receive the full reward. Everyone who goes beyond and does not abide in the teaching about Christ does not have God. The one who abides in the teaching, this one, is with the Father and the Son. And if anyone come to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into the house, and do not give him a greeting. The one who gives him a greeting shares in his evil works. So this is one of those times where it makes sense if we're talking about a church instead of an individual, right? Because if John here, I want to say Paul, but if John here is writing to one woman and saying, oh, these false teachers are going to come and try and talk to you and come to your house and greet you, I mean, why would they be coming to this one lady and her children in particular, right? But if we think about this in terms of a congregation, it would make sense for a false teacher to come to a congregation, as was the time, and say, all right, I'll give the message today. I have something to say. And they would then espouse these false teachings in front of the whole congregation. That would be an admonition worth repeating there, that you are not to allow these false teachers to speak in front of you. One of the interesting parts of this, too, is the word that we have translated deceivers is a very strong word. It's seducers, or ones who lead astray. It's the idea that these guys are going to come in and try and bring people away from the truth of Scriptures. So the way that this idea of watch out for yourselves in order that you might not lose what you have worked for is translated in the New International Version. The author says here, it may well be translated, or better translated, watch out for yourselves, you may not lose what we have worked for. That there was this idea that John's missionary efforts went into planting this congregation, to growing them, to helping them understand the gospel, and he's looking out for this congregation so that they don't fall astray into the false teachings of these antichrist teachers who they were dealing with. Same bad guys that we've been dealing with in the other book we were looking at, right? People who denied that Jesus came in the flesh. The way John phrases this too, he sort of has this idea I said earlier from the text that the people were living in the truth. They were among the truth. They were planted in truth as if it were a place, right? And going on here, John uses the same sort of wording again. If we do not abide, if we do not dwell, almost as if we put our house in the territory of the teaching or doctrines of Christ, we do not have God. So if this lady isn't living, it doesn't have her home in the teachings of Christ, we're not with God here. Continuing with that idea, we have two options for interpreting it here. A subjective, what Christ taught, or an objective, what was taught about Christ. Now that's grammatical subject and object, right? And not whether it's up for interpretation or whether it's observable fact. But what we're saying is, grammatically, is Jesus the subject of the teaching, or is Jesus the one who was doing the teaching? That's what I'm trying to say. So in that case, the second option, what was taught about Christ, seems to be the best option for the immediate context. Remember, we're talking about John's missionary efforts which planted this church. And so remaining in the doctrines of the apostles, remaining in the teachings about Jesus, are what is important here to continue your Christian life. So if in that case, if you're trying to remain in the teachings about Jesus, and someone comes along and tries to change those teachings and tell you, oh, the things that you know about Jesus aren't true, he's not really God come in the flesh, we have a better understanding, that makes perfect sense then to say, okay, that's what John is warning them against, this antichrist philosophy that was creeping in. That was a big part of John's mission. And we saw that in this last letter, we see it here. That John was trying to defend people against this creeping in of the idea that the body and the soul had to be separate, and therefore Jesus could not have come in the flesh. We're also, when we're talking about this greeting, right, he says, do not offer them a greeting. John is not merely just saying, don't say hi to these guys. He's saying, don't treat them like you would treat one of your members of the church. Don't bring him into the assembly and let him have a place where he gets to have a high position of authority. You could even say sort of like, don't fellowship with him, might be a way that we would put that. Disfellowship him, might be a way to put that in modern terms. You want that person outside of the church. Because not only is he someone who doesn't believe, but he's somebody who's actually actively teaching against the teachings of about Jesus that we hold to be true. The author puts it this way. John is concerned, this is the top of 122 here, that if the false teacher is treated as a member in good standing or an orthodox preacher, the message will be compromised and the witness of the lady and her children will be ruined. John warns, do not give him a greeting. Literally, do not say to him, rejoice. So don't say to him, rejoice is that a greeting that the Christians gave to each other at the time. Rejoice, the Lord is among us. Jesus has risen. God is victorious. That sort of an idea is what's being conveyed there. He's saying, don't treat them like you would treat one of the other members of your church. And so finally we come to the last two verses of 2 John. This is a short chapter for a short book. Although I have many things to say to you, I do not wish to write with paper and ink, but I hope to be with you and speak to you face to face in order that our joy might be fulfilled. The children of your elect sister greet And so we get that elect sister there, where if the lady's name was elect, that would not make much sense to have two sisters who have the same first name. Not a common practice, even in that part of that time or that part of the world. You kind of want to be able to tell your kids apart. Giving them the same name is not a good way to do that. We don't, unless there was somebody out there who was like the first century George Foreman going around naming all of his kids the exact same name, we're not having that here. One other thing that we can keep in mind as we're looking at this, John says, I have many things I wish to say to you, but I wish to say them face to face. The author makes a point of, for some reason, translating the idiom there for us. The literal translation from the Greek idiom, instead of face to face, is mouth to mouth. So meaning that he doesn't want to write them in words, but he wants to speak to them in person. And so the idea here is John is just looking to greet them soon. He's missing his people that he helped to plant this church. And he's still an overseer of it in a significant way. And one of the things we might want to do is speculate about what are these things John wants to say? What has he left unwritten in his book? What are the things he wants to convey in person? But I think it's more likely, and the author agrees here, that John has spent this short letter sort of warning the people about the bad things that they need to be on guard against. So he hasn't taken any time to actually encourage them or say positive things, or to praise them about good stuff that they've done, or to even just sort of give them another word from the scripture of something to encourage them. He hasn't sort of elucidated on anything from Jesus' life or from the Old Testament and said, here's some teachings for you. In other words, he hasn't written them a sermon or a tract for them to learn from. He's basically given them this short warning. And so I think if he was, whatever he's missing is that opportunity to say more. But the urgency of the topic, it seems to me, led for him to, rather than sit down and write a whole letter to be read like a sermon in front of the congregation, as was sort of the practice in that time, he just wrote a warning so that he could get the very essential point across. Watch out for these false teachers. That's the main thing I want you to know. And say. That was as far as the letter got, because that's all he had. That's the most urgent thing, and he needed to go to them as soon as possible. There is something to be said about that, because I think sometimes when we read the Bible, we have all the time in the world to leisurely go through, like we did this morning, and read each letter of each word and say, now, was that capitalized or was that lowercase in the original text? All right, I'll give you a hint. They were all capitalized, and there was no spaces of punctuation. That was how they used to write back then. There's one of the great advances of literature was at some point in the Middle Ages, right before the Renaissance, they started putting capitals and spaces and punctuation into different languages, because that was the only way to read things silently. Before then, people read out loud to themselves because that was the only way to sound out and tell where one word ended and the other one started. Because it was all one big run-on sentence with just a bunch of letters crammed together. So if you ever enjoy reading quietly and silently in your own head to yourself, you can thank the biblical scholars from the Middle Ages for that, because they figured out how to do that in order to make it easier to read things to themselves. I can't remember exactly who it was, but there's a bishop from the Catholic Church in England prior to the whole Protestant split that he was famous among the other clergy of the day for being able to silently read, because the words were all running together. How did he figure out what word was which? But he was smart enough to do that. So anyway, I said all of that aside stuff to say, when we're reading the Bible, sometimes we take our time and we go through it, and we take it apart word by word, and we say, what does this mean, what does that mean? But when it was being written, sometimes there was stuff like this, where John was like, I need to get this letter written and out the door, because these people need this message now. They need to hear from me, they need this encouragement and this warning right now. As soon as the guy who's carrying the letter can get there and put it in their hands, they need to hear it. And so I think that's just another layer of context as we're reading the scripture we need to be able to think about, is not only who was writing it and to whom, but what was the circumstance around it? How urgent did they feel this message was? And I can't help but feel like John really wanted to get this message to them right away. On the sort of just as an afterthought to that, this is not a position I'm ready to defend, but this is just speculation. So take this or leave it, it's not important. But I think that might have been part of the reason why it was delivered the way it was in this vague way, right? It was addressed to a lady and her children instead of the church at so-and-so congregation in such and such a city. I think maybe John was like, in case somebody else gets a hold of this that shouldn't, in case some Roman soldier stops my messenger, I want this to look like a letter to a friend. And so I'll put it in sort of vague terms and send it. So, I don't know, I could be wrong about that, but if you think about it in terms of an urgent letter that you couldn't make sure that you were sneaking around and making it around all the checkpoints if there was somebody looking over his shoulder to see what the letter said or going through his stuff. That's just speculation. Like I said, you can take that or leave it. But that might explain part of the reason why some of this metaphor. Well, that's all of my comments on this. There are handouts in the back for those of you who want to use those for your own study. This chapter only has, 4 questions? Yeah, 4 questions. So we'll have plenty of time to talk about all of our questions on Wednesday, and we will definitely do that. I appreciate your kind attention for our class this morning, and we'll resume in just a few moments.